We know who the party is that is responsible, okay? And that's the person who's probably been arrested and charged with manufacturing methamphetamine. The problem is these folks are usually have very limited resources and may be going to prison. And to recoup that money becomes very, very difficult, okay? So if you can head these things off, if you can stop this before it gets to that point, if you can make that call early, that's the best thing you can do. Yes, sir?
Is the methamphetamine manufactured in Posey County being sold in Posey County, or is it one other place?
You know, it is usually, and this is my opinion, you may want to elaborate on this, but I believe it's being used and sold mostly here, okay? If you're talking about methamphetamine that's being made and then shipped somewhere to be sold, you're probably talking about Mexico. That is probably the primary source where it's being trafficked in large amounts to different places to be sold. A lot of the folks who are manufacturing are just using themselves and their close friends. And you have has anybody ever heard the term smurfing? It seems innocent enough, the little blue guys that, you know, and there's the wizard and all that. Well, that's not what this is about. Smurfing is when they go in and buy these pills, and they're giving these pills to the cook, and they're getting a cut off of what these cooks are making, okay? So a lot of these folks are not big-time dealers in the sense that everybody's coming to them for the meth. It's just they're supplying all their close friends and themselves with it. And yes, they are dealing, but a lot of that is to support their own habit. You know, when we go to these houses and make a bust, you don't see fancy cars and large stacks of cash most times and big screen TVs. What you find is a place that is completely trashed. You know, I think of one case in particular. They took 2 kids out of this house. There was a lawnmower in the kitchen. There was, I mean, just the walls were torn down, and this was a renter, you know, this was somebody else's home, and the place was completely unlivable. But, you know, they had been cooking and selling probably a little bit here and there, but mostly they were using, and it just tore the place apart. Really despicable living conditions. It's actually kind of hard to describe unless you see pictures. Yes, sir?
What is the range of cost for these cleanups? You talk about
yeah, well, I think it can be as little as $500, but it can be as much as, you know, $16,000 from what I've seen from talking to the health inspector, from talking to Detective Rose. But you know, some of these, we've had cases where, let's say, an old farmhouse that folks are renting out, you know, because they built a new house somewhere else, they're renting out the old farmhouse, they've just had to bulldoze them because it's just completely, the cost of redoing everything just isn't worth it at this point. So those are some of the problems you run into. It's just huge cost.
To go along with that, not only a farmhouse, but if any of you are farmers and you have a remote barn somewhere, especially one of the older wood barns that's not secure, so to speak, they will slip into your barn of a night and cook their meth there, slip out. You may not notice it for quite some time, and now you have a contaminated building. And the barn, same as the house, falls under the same Indiana code requirements. A vehicle is the same as a house, and quite often they cook inside the vehicles.
This is the notice that you would get from Detective Rose that he would leave on the property once he's come in and there's been a meth lab found there and hazardous materials. And as you guys know, you're talking about ether, you're talking about anhydrous, you're talking about all these chemicals that are very corrosive, very dangerous. And in fact, our court system, our Indiana Supreme Court, has held that it's an exigent circumstance if these fumes are so pervasive. You know, sometimes you smell them from the road. I mean, they'll just hit you from the road when the officers are out patrolling. That literally, if you know there's someone in that house, it is an emergency circumstance where the police will go in and get them and take them out of the house and then apply for a search warrant if necessary. But these things are very dangerous. The fumes can overtake someone. The crazy thing about it is these folks live in this so much that, you know, stuff that you and I would walk into and it would knock us down, it's not bothering them at all. So just very, very dangerous chemicals. So this is the notice that you'll get. This could be put on a barn, on a house, on a car. A lot of these folks will have a rental car and they'll use that to have a meth lab in the trunk, okay? And they'll drive around in that rental car. Now, this is loosely based off of the Administrative Code 318, okay? And I'm just going to read you that code. It says, the owner of the contaminated property shall clean up the contaminated property as required by this article before, and then it says, continuing to occupy or use the property, reoccupying or reusing the property, allowing the property to be reoccupied, or transferring any interest in the property. Now, I'll pass this around if you guys want to take a look at the code, but that's kind of what governs, that's the starting point for what rights do the landowners have. So right now, it falls on the landowner. Now, does that stop you from going after the responsible party? It doesn't, but then the question is, what do you get out of it? Now, if they have resources, if they post a large bond, if there is something that can be gone after, then maybe you can recoup some of this money. But again, these are folks who generally don't have a lot of resources. If you've had a case in court and you've had damages of some sort, let's say it's a criminal case and somebody has stolen something from you and you didn't recover that. Let's say it's your radio. You're entitled to restitution, okay? Restitution is that person who's been charged with that crime, once he's convicted or once he's entered into a plea agreement, will pay you back for what you lost. Now, there's nothing that stops us from getting restitution in cases like this except for the fact that they don't have the resources, okay? And especially if somebody's going off to prison for 10, 15, 20 years, depending on their record, when are you going to recoup that money becomes the question. So it's very difficult. Kenny, if you would tell a little bit about, well, first, tell a little bit about the narcotics unit, what you guys do just briefly, and tell a little bit about what you do going into a house, what forms you leave, and what happens next, kind of the process.
Okay.
Come up to the podium if you want.
All right. Well, to give you a little idea about our narcotics unit or the drug task force, it was formed under the prosecutor's office in January 1996 after out on Old Broadway or out past Bustler's there in the south end of the county here. There was a large meth lab discovered there. The Indiana State Police and some Vandenberg and Evansville detectives worked it along with local law enforcement. And we perceived that problem, or that becoming a problem. We received notices from the federal government that it was on its way. And so in January '96, under the prosecutor's office, we formed the drug task force, or what's commonly called the Posey County Narcotics Unit. And it was pretty lean days then. It was just me. It was just me. I did have a county deputy, the late Jim Reeves. Some of you probably know him. He and I basically formed the unit together. I had him 2 days a week from the sheriff's department. Now, we've always tapped into the resources, people such as the town marshal here, Scott Champlin, Doug Sauce from Poseville. That's where you gather your intel from. And the city patrol officers, the other county deputies, what have you. But it was pretty lean in those days. We did not even have a camera. I had a pager, and we had Jim's old white GMC pickup truck. And we would go around and do, when we had info a couple of 3 times on the same person, we not to give up any trade secrets, but we'd do what we call a trash grab or trash pull, or we'd go do a knock and talk and end up getting enough for a search warrant, and I'm talking 15, 16 years ago. And but then finally got Jim full-time, and then the Mount Vernon City Police jumped on board. They gave me a full-time detective sergeant, the same as Jim's counterpart, only with the city. It was Terry Cooper. Some of you may have known the late Terry Cooper. Over time, my unit, obviously due to attrition, has changed out. I have Glenn Boyster, Detective Sergeant, Mount Vernon City Police, and Detective Sergeant Jeremy Fortune from the Posey County Sheriff's Department. Then we went into full swing. Labs really busted out at that point. And let me give you just a little bit, briefly here, over a couple of minutes, of the history of methamphetamine to give you a little understanding of what's going on here. Methamphetamine has been around a long, long time. In fact, to mom and pop pharmacies, research and development, it was actually discovered through R&D in 1887. Yes, 1887. It's been around a long time. They couldn't find a practical use for it. 1920s, pharmaceutical companies started taking another look at it, couldn't really figure out a good use for it, so it went dormant. Then World War II came along. And to shorten the process, the Germans, and not just Germans, but it was the Nazi Party, discovered a shortcut on the manufacturing process using anhydrous ammonia. And of course they were allies with Japan, so they shared that knowledge with Japan. And where we would rotate our combat line troops off the line every so often, Germany and Japan didn't do that whole lot. So when, like the kamikaze pilots in World War II, you see the black and white newsreels of those days, excuse me, the ceremony of the kamikaze pilots drinking their sake, well, that was laced with methamphetamine. That's why they didn't mind crashing their planes into our ships. So it was dubbed the Nazi method years later. Then the 1960s came around, and the 1% outlaw motorcycle gangs basically ran that trade in California and Arizona, out in that area. They used what was called the old red pea method, or red phosphorus, which gives off phosphine gas. How the law enforcement discovered that this was a bad thing: motel room, first documentation, 2 California officers respond to this call of a strange smell coming from it. They go inside this motel room, and they don't answer the radio after that. They send 2 more officers. Those 2 officers call out of the car, go in that room. They don't come out. Finally, when they sent the 5th and 6th officer, they said something's wrong here, so they called the fire department. They found all the officers dead. They red pea manufacture method of methamphetamine gives off phosphine gas, and they were dropping dead. In the 60s and 70s, like I said, the 1% biker gangs controlled that. Then they started getting arrested out in California and Arizona and going off to prison. Well, Mexico does not control pseudoephedrine or ephedrine like the United States does. So they muscled in the Hispanic criminal element and took the trade over. And that flourished throughout the 80s. And through our transportation system, methamphetamine, you stay awake. I interviewed one person that didn't sleep for 9 days. That were what we refer to as tweaking. Some truck drivers in the transportation would take meth to stay awake on the long cross-country hauls. Well, the knowledge on how to manufacture meth slowly started working its way across the United States. In the 1990s, it finally hit us. We took our first lab off in Posey County in January 1999. As of yesterday, and from that time to yesterday, we've taken off 771 labs. Not all of them with the rest. They throw this on your farmland, in the water supply, gets in the water table, things of that nature. So that's basically the history of methamphetamine, and they've come up with several methods of cooking. Now what we deal with is either the old-fashioned Nazi method or the one-pot method I was referring to earlier. Then, as far as the unit, once we got rolling along, we were tired of being reactive. We met with the sheriff and the new prosecutor, and we became proactive, got the funding and resources that we needed, both financial and equipment-wise. And then Detective Sergeant Jeremy Fortune also was sworn in on the FBI Violent Offender Task Force. They also help with drugs. So we work almost on a daily basis with the FBI's Violent Offender Task Force. The reason why they're allowed to do it, you would think, well, what's that to do with the FBI? There's so many outcroppings of what meth leads to. It's just not drug usage. The proceeds on the one that are manufacturing for profit put those funds not just back into producing more methamphetamine, but purchase of weapons, setting up prostitution, burglary rings, theft rings, things of that nature. So the money actually goes a lot of different places, which will eventually lead to other crimes. Who has to go get those guns? We do.